Have you ever thought about the words, "My home is my fortress"? Have you ever questioned that statement? What if I told you it was just an illusion? What if I told you that it's just a self-delusion, a comforting reassurance that could collapse in an instant? When we arrived back home from our holiday, I remember the familiar weight of the keys in my hand. The sound of the lock clicking open was just as it had always been, but something felt different. At first it was subtle, so subtle that I tried to convince myself it was just in my head. I mean, how could it not be? We were gone for 2 weeks, and everything looked exactly as we'd left it. Exactly. The door swung open, and a wave of stale air hit us. I caught a whiff of dust, of a home that had been abandoned for a time. Normally that wouldn't have bothered me. After all, houses get stuffy when they're closed up for a while. But there was something else, the sense that the house had been waiting. We dragged our suitcases through the foyer, the wheels making a dull rumble against the floorboards. I felt it again, that faint sensation, like someone else had been here. I dismissed the thought, shaking my head. I had just been away too long. A trick of the mind, nothing more. But then I saw it, the picture on the wall. It wasn't off by much, but it was definitely shifted. I had hung that photograph myself, and I knew every angle by heart. And now it was crooked just a little, enough to notice if you were looking closely. "Do you see that?" I asked my wife, gesturing toward the wall. She shrugged, her voice casual. "It's probably the house settling. It happens." But I couldn't shake it. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I looked around. The living room was exactly as we'd left it. The curtains drawn, the furniture in place, the coffee cup still sitting on the side table where I'd forgotten it in our rush to the airport. And yet everything felt wrong. We spent the next hour unpacking. My wife went upstairs while I stayed behind, trying to rid myself of this growing discomfort. I checked the locks on the windows twice. My rational mind kept telling me it was fine, that there was no logical reason for this paranoia. But I couldn't stop glancing at that photograph. When I finally made my way upstairs, I found my wife already in bed, reading. I lingered in the doorway for a moment, staring at the room. It was our bedroom, familiar and safe, but under the surface, something felt off, like the air was heavier, like the shadows in the corners of the room were just a little too dark. "What's up?" she asked, lowering her book. I forced a smile. Nothing. Just tired, I guess. I slid into bed, hoping sleep would erase the strange tension gnawing at me. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the house creak and groan in its usual ways, I couldn't help but think. What if it wasn't the house? What if something had been inside, watching, waiting? It was the middle of the night when I woke up drenched in sweat. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't remember why. No dreams, no nightmares, just that eerie, crawling feeling. The house was still, too still. I lay there for a moment, listening, but the silence was oppressive. I sat up, the bed sheets tangled around my legs. For some reason, my eyes were drawn to the closet. The door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd closed it before we left. My skin prickled as I stared at the darkness within, my mind racing with irrational thoughts. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I had probably just forgotten to close it properly, but the longer I stared, the more the darkness seemed to twist, like it was alive, breathing in the shadows. I forced myself out of bed, each step toward the closet feeling heavier than the last. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door, pulling it open with a slow creak. Empty. Of course it was empty. I released the breath I hadn't realized I was holding and closed the door firmly. But as I turned to go back to bed, I saw something in the mirror, a reflection. Not mine. It was just a flicker, a shadow moving in the corner of the room behind me. I spun around, my pulse hammering in my throat. Nothing. Just the dim outlines of furniture in the moonlight. I stood there paralyzed for a moment, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, on edge. I crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up tight, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak, every rustle outside sent a jolt of fear through me. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone had been here. Maybe someone still was. The next morning I tried to shake it off. It was just stress. Paranoia. The house was empty, and we were fine. I convinced myself of this as I made coffee, the familiar routine grounding me. My wife didn't seem to notice anything unusual, and I was grateful for that. If I mentioned how I felt, she'd just laugh it off, tell me I was overthinking. But as I sat at the kitchen table sipping my coffee, something caught my eye. The knife block on the counter. The largest knife was missing. I froze. My mind raced, trying to remember, did we take it out before we left? No, I was sure we hadn't. I stood up, scanning the kitchen, but the knife was nowhere to be found. I tried to stay calm. Maybe my wife had moved it. Maybe I had. I didn't want to ask her, didn't want her to see how shaken I was by something so trivial. But it wasn't trivial, not to me. It felt like a piece of the puzzle was missing, and I was left in the dark, grasping at shadows. That night I locked every window, checked every door, twice. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too still, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. When we went to bed, the unease followed me. I could feel it creeping into my mind, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. My wife fell asleep quickly, her breathing soft and steady, but I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside felt too loud, too close. Around 3 a.m. I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They were coming from downstairs. My heart stopped. I listened, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. But no, these were footsteps, steady, moving. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my wife. My hands shook as I reached for the baseball bat I kept by the closet, my breath shallow and quick. The hallway was dark, and every step felt like I was walking into a nightmare. As I reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. Silence. My mind raced. Was I imagining it? Was this all in my head? I strained my ears, waiting for something, anything, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. And then from the bottom of the stairs I saw it, a shadow darker than the darkness itself, standing still, watching. I froze, my grip tightening on the bat. The shadow didn't move, didn't breathe. My throat went dry as I stared, willing it to be a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But it wasn't. The figure shifted, just slightly, enough to send a chill through me. And then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. My knees buckled, and I had to catch myself on the banister. I stumbled back into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me, locking it tight. My wife stirred, half awake, mumbling something I couldn't understand. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Emma and Mark had finally found their dream home. It was a modest 2-story house nestled on the outskirts of town, away from the noise and hustle of city life. The price was unbeatable, almost too good to be true. But the young couple didn't question their fortune. They were eager to settle into the quiet, idyllic life they had long sought. At first, everything seemed perfect. The old house had a certain charm, with its creaky floors and antique fixtures. It was a fixer-upper, no doubt, but they saw it as a blank canvas on which to paint their future. The first few weeks passed without incident as they worked on minor repairs, repainted walls, and filled the house with the warmth of their new life together. But soon, odd things started happening. It began with little details that were easy to dismiss. Keys left on the counter would turn up in the living room. Drawers would be slightly open when they swore they'd shut them. A door here and there would creak open by itself, though they rationalized it as drafts from the old windows. Emma joked that the house was trying to test their patience, and Mark would laugh it off, brushing aside the unease creeping in. One night, as they lay in bed, a loud thump echoed from above. Emma startled awake, her heart pounding in the silence. Mark groggily assured her it was probably just a tree branch hitting the roof. Still, the unease clung to them both like a cold blanket. As days turned into weeks, the small disturbances grew more frequent. Emma started noticing her belongings going missing, small things like hairpins, a comb, her favorite scarf. Mark, too, began to feel unsettled. He'd leave tools in the garage only to find them scattered elsewhere, or worse, missing altogether. Still, they chalked it up to their own disorganization and the chaos of settling in. It wasn't until Emma found an unfamiliar dirty plate in the sink one morning that her growing dread solidified. Neither of them had used the dishware the night before. She showed it to Mark, her voice trembling. He tried to remain calm, but there was something in his eyes, a flash of fear that he couldn't quite hide. That night, they decided to check every corner of the house, convinced they were just being paranoid. The basement was dusty and filled with boxes they hadn't yet unpacked. The attic, on the other hand, was an entirely different matter. The ladder creaked as Mark climbed up into the darkness, a flashlight trembling in his hand. The air in the attic was stifling, thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. As the beam of light swept across the dusty rafters, he froze. There, in the far corner, was a small makeshift bed, a pile of old blankets, and a few empty food containers scattered around. Emma's scarf was lying there, crumpled and filthy. Panic surged through them both as the realization hit someone had been living in their house. Mark's mind raced. How long had this person been here? And worse, were they still inside? They called the police, who arrived within the hour. The officers searched the house but found no sign of the intruder. Whoever had been living in the attic was long gone, or so it seemed. The police advised them to stay vigilant, offering little reassurance as they left. The couple felt an eerie sense of exposure, as though their lives had been intruded upon in the most intimate of ways. Someone had been watching them, living with them. In the days that followed, Mark installed new locks and set up a security camera system, hoping to restore some semblance of safety. But the feeling of being watched never left Emma. Every creak, every shadow in the corner of her eye set her on edge. Then came the night when things escalated beyond anything they could have imagined. It was a chilly, moonless evening when Emma woke to the sound of footsteps, soft but unmistakable, moving slowly down the hallway outside their bedroom. She froze, her pulse racing, as Mark stirred beside her. She shook him awake, whispering in terror. They both listened, holding their breath, as the footsteps stopped just outside their door. Mark, gathering every ounce of courage he had, grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the bed. He motioned for Emma to stay quiet as he crept toward the door. With one swift movement, he yanked it open, swinging the bat in a defensive arc. But the hallway was empty. The couple's relief was short-lived, though, as they heard a loud crash from the kitchen downstairs. Mark rushed down the stairs, Emma following close behind. As they reached the kitchen, the scene was one of chaos. Cabinets had been thrown open, dishes scattered across the floor. The back door was wide open, letting in the cold night air. Without thinking, Mark charged outside, his bat raised. But there was no one, just the vast, silent darkness of the backyard. The police arrived once again, but once more found no trace of the intruder. They told the couple to lock up tight, and there was little else they could do. The house felt violated, and Emma and Mark were left with a gnawing sense of vulnerability. Days passed, and the couple did everything they could to stay alert. They barely slept, kept all the doors locked, and checked the cameras obsessively. But nothing new turned up, no strange faces, no further disturbances. Until one evening when Emma, scrolling through the past week's camera footage, froze. Her hands trembled as she rewound the video from 2 nights before. In the dim light of the footage, the camera caught a figure tall, hunched, and moving stealthily, emerging from the attic door, descending the stairs and wandering the house while they slept. The figure lingered by their bedroom door for minutes that felt like an eternity. Then, just before sunrise, it slipped back up into the attic. They had never been alone. The police returned immediately and conducted another thorough search, but this time the intruder was gone. What they found, however, horrified the couple even more. The attic had hidden compartments they hadn't discovered before, with evidence suggesting the man had been there for months, since before they'd even moved in. Crumbs, cigarette butts, and stolen belongings were scattered everywhere. It was only then that the full horror of their situation became clear. The previous renters had been involved in a string of robberies, and it seemed that one of them had decided to hide out in the house, unnoticed. He had lived in the walls of their lives, unseen but always there, waiting, watching. Emma and Mark moved out the next day, but the scars of that experience lingered. Every creak of a floorboard, every whisper of wind in a new house would bring back that suffocating fear, the knowledge that, even in the safest of places, you might not be as alone as you think. The hidden hands are always watching. I always imagined that buying our first home would be a dream come true, a place where my wife Anna, our son Ethan, and I could build our life together. It was an ordinary suburban house, nothing spectacular. The agent had told us it was a steal, but we didn't question why. It seemed perfect. Until the first night. It started with the locks. We noticed them right away, thick, bolted steel deadbolts on every door. The windows, too, were fitted with bars. Anna laughed it off, saying it was probably the previous owner being cautious, but I didn't feel right. Who installs security like this in the middle of a peaceful neighborhood? Still, it was late, and we decided to deal with it in the morning. Morning came, but the house felt different. Ethan, barely 5, was running around, laughing like nothing had changed, but Anna and I couldn't shake the unease. When I went to leave for work, the front door wouldn't budge. At first, I thought it was jammed. I tugged harder. The door didn't even rattle. It was as if it had been welded shut. "Babe, the back door is the same," Anna called out, her voice trembling. Panic set in. I ran to the nearest window, but it wouldn't open. None of them would. The windows, even those without bars, were sealed as if they were never meant to open at all. My breath quickened. The walls of the house seemed to close in, and the air felt thick with an oppressive force. "We'll call someone," I said, trying to stay calm for Anna's sake. But the call never went through. The phones, too, were dead. No signal, no internet. It was as if the house existed in a bubble cut off from the world. Hours turned into days, and the routine of living in a sealed box began to gnaw at our sanity. At first, we tried to keep it together. I searched for ways to break out. I tried kicking down doors, smashing windows. Nothing worked. Every attempt felt futile, as if the house was watching, mocking us. Then, the notes started appearing. It was Anna who found the first one, taped to the refrigerator. A single sentence, written in jagged, almost frantic handwriting, "You can't leave." I told her it was probably just some prank by the previous owners, but I didn't believe my own words. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside sent my nerves into overdrive. The second note came the next morning. It was pinned to Ethan's bedroom door. There's no escape. My heart stopped. Who was doing this? How were they getting in? I rushed through the house, checking every possible entry, but there was nothing. No one. Only us. Ethan was still oblivious, playing with his toys, laughing and asking when we could go outside. The innocence in his voice was unbearable. He didn't understand, and I didn't know how to explain it to him. Anna, on the other hand, was unraveling. The notes shook her to her core. She started jumping at the slightest sounds, pacing through the halls, her eyes darting from corner to corner as if expecting someone to leap out at her. We tried everything. We screamed for help from the windows, banged on the walls, hoping a neighbor might hear us, but it was as though the house had swallowed us whole. Our voices, our cries, they went nowhere. The third note came in the middle of the night, left at the foot of our bed. "Stay still, or I will come for you." That's when I knew it wasn't just the house. Someone was watching us. Someone inside. I could feel it. The air had a tangible weight to it now, a presence lingering in the shadows. I didn't tell Anna. I couldn't. Each day that followed, the torment became worse. The lights would flicker on and off at random. We'd wake up to furniture moved, strange symbols scratched into the walls, and more notes, always more notes. Some were warnings, others taunts. The most terrifying ones simply said, "Soon." There was no pattern, no logic. Every moment became a waking nightmare. The doors that wouldn't open, the windows that wouldn't shatter, they began to feel like prison bars, trapping us, keeping us at the mercy of whatever was toying with us. Then, one night, it happened. I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps. Not Anna's, not Ethan's. These were heavier, deliberate, pacing outside our bedroom door. My heart raced, and I felt sweat bead on my forehead. The house was silent, save for those footsteps. I shook Anna awake, whispering for her to be quiet, but she had already heard it. We both sat in the dark, terrified, clutching each other as the steps moved closer. Whoever or whatever it was, it stopped just outside our door. For hours we stayed like that, frozen, too afraid to even breathe. Then, slowly, the handle on the door began to turn. It was too much. I leaped out of bed, grabbing the nearest object I could find, a lamp, and hurled it at the door. There was a loud crash, and for a moment, everything went still. No footsteps, no sounds, just suffocating silence. Anna broke into sobs, clutching me like a lifeline. "We have to get out," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We have to." But we couldn't. There was no way out. In the morning, Ethan's bedroom was empty. We searched everywhere, tearing through the house, screaming his name, but he was gone. Just gone. No sign of forced entry, no trace of him. Only a new note, left neatly in the middle of the floor. "He's mine now." I broke. Whatever strength I'd left dissolved in that moment. Our son was gone, and we had no way to find him. Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. Time lost its meaning. We wandered the house like ghosts, hollow and broken. The footsteps came every night, taunting us. The notes continued, each one more deranged than the last. Anna, she couldn't take it anymore. One morning I found her standing by the window, staring at the sky. She didn't say a word, just held out a note she had found taped to the glass. "There's only one way out." And then she was gone, too. I'm alone now. I haven't seen anyone, heard anything, except for the footsteps that come every night, growing louder and louder. I don't know who or what is behind it. Maybe the house itself is alive, feeding on us, driving us mad until there's nothing left. The latest note came this morning, left on the kitchen table. "You're next. There's no escape. Not for me, not for anyone. The house has claimed us. And soon it will claim you too." I remember the night it all began. It was supposed to be an ordinary party, a reunion of old friends, nothing more, nothing less. There was laughter, music, and way too much alcohol. We hadn't all been together like this in years, and the atmosphere felt electric. For the first time in a while, things felt normal, like life wasn't pulling us in 1,000 different directions. We were just us. That's what makes everything that came after so much harder to grasp. The photos. The stupid photos. We were all sitting in my living room, scrolling through the hundreds of pictures we'd taken. You know how it goes, people huddled together, drinks in hand, ridiculous poses and stupid faces. It was all so mundane, so familiar, until it wasn't. Jenna was the first to notice. She had been flipping through the pictures on her phone, laughing at a particularly bad one of me with my eyes half closed, when her laughter abruptly stopped. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. I leaned in to look at the screen. It was a group shot, me, Jenna, Chris, and Maddie standing in front of the bar. Typical party photo. But just behind us, in the shadows, was a man. I didn't recognize him. His face was blurred, but something about him sent a shiver down my spine. He stood apart, unsmiling, his eyes fixed on us like he didn't belong but had forced his way into the frame. We all stared at the picture, confused. "I don't remember him being there," Chris said, scratching his head. "Did one of you invite someone else?" "No," Maddie replied, shaking her head. "I know everyone at the party. He wasn't there." At first, we all shrugged it off. Parties get chaotic. People show up uninvited sometimes, right? Maybe he was just some random guy who wandered in for a few minutes before leaving. But something about the way he was watching us, the intensity in his blurred stare, gnawed at me. The next morning, the photos kept haunting me. I went through them again on my phone, scanning each one carefully. That's when I noticed something else. He wasn't just in that one picture. The man was in every photo, in the background, always lurking. Sometimes his face was hidden in the shadows, other times just out of focus, but he was always there, watching. I called Jenna. "Did you look through the other pictures?" I asked, my voice tight with anxiety. Yeah, I was going to ask you the same thing, she replied. He's in all of them. The next few days passed in a blur. None of us could explain it. Chris tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a glitch with the camera, some kind of strange distortion. But deep down, we all felt it. Something was terribly wrong. Maddie, always the pragmatic one, suggested we try to identify him. He's just a guy, she said. If he was at the party, someone must know him. We spent hours combing through social media, posting the photos in local groups, asking if anyone recognized him. But no one did. It was like he didn't exist. Then, things got worse. Jenna called me one night, her voice trembling with fear. He was outside my apartment, she whispered. I saw him, the man from the photos. My heart dropped. Are you sure? I'm sure, she said, her voice barely audible. He was just standing there, staring up at my window. I thought I was imagining it, but then he waved, like he knew I was watching him. We reported it to the police, of course. They didn't take us seriously. Why would they? We were just a bunch of young people, probably drunk, seeing things. There was no evidence, no fingerprints, no security footage. Just a series of blurry photos and our growing paranoia. But we weren't imagining it. He started appearing more often, sometimes in broad daylight, standing across the street from one of us, or sitting on a park bench as we passed by. Always silent, always watching. We couldn't escape him. He seemed to know where we were at all times, like he was one step ahead, stalking us without ever getting too close. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced I had heard something outside my window. I didn't want to look, but something in me couldn't resist. I pulled back the curtain, heart pounding in my chest, and there he was, standing under the streetlight, looking directly at me. The street was empty. The way his shadow stretched unnaturally long across the pavement made him seem like something out of a nightmare. I don't know how long we stood like that, staring at each other. Seconds? Minutes? I don't remember. But what I do remember is the feeling that washed over me, the realization that he wasn't just following us. He was waiting for something. It was around this time that Maddie started having nightmares. She would wake up screaming, claiming she saw him in her dreams, standing over her, whispering things she couldn't understand. She stopped going to work, locked herself inside her apartment, afraid to leave. Then Chris disappeared. We hadn't heard from him in days. His phone went straight to voicemail. His apartment was empty, his car still parked outside. The police didn't find any signs of foul play, no forced entry, nothing. It was like he had simply vanished. Jenna and I were terrified. We started sleeping with the lights on, checking the locks obsessively. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like him, creeping closer. The fear was suffocating, consuming every moment of our lives. We were prisoners in our own homes, but there was nowhere to run. He would always be there waiting. One night, a new photo appeared on my phone. I hadn't taken it, but it was there in my gallery, as if it had been placed there intentionally. It was a picture of Chris sitting in a dark room, his face blank, his eyes hollow. And there, behind him, was the man, closer than ever before. Jenna called me seconds later. I got the same photo, she whispered, her voice trembling with terror. We knew we were next. I wish I could tell you we found a way to stop him, that we uncovered some grand conspiracy or learned his identity. But the truth is, we never figured it out. The man, whoever or whatever he was, kept closing in, inch by inch, until we couldn't escape him. Jenna disappeared 3 days ago. I woke up to find her side of the bed cold, the front door slightly ajar. No sign of struggle, just gone. Now, I'm alone. I can feel him, even now, as I write this. He's closer than ever. I can hear his footsteps outside, pacing back and forth, waiting. He doesn't rush. He has all the time in the world. And soon I won't be here to tell this story. I don't know when I first met him, but I can't shake the feeling that he has been lurking in the shadows of my mind long before he stepped into my dreams. The first night I was simply drifting into sleep, blissfully unaware of the nightmare that would soon consume my life. The dream began like any other, a blurry landscape filled with soft, muted colors. But as the image sharpened, I found myself standing in an empty alley, the walls towering around me, casting long shadows that twisted and turned as if alive. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the air thick with something I couldn't name, dread perhaps. And then I saw him. He was at the far end of the alley, a figure cloaked in darkness. His face was obscured, but I could sense his eyes boring into me, hungry and unyielding. The air felt electric, charged with a tension that sent my heart racing. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I turned to run, the echo of my footsteps bouncing off the brick walls, my breath quickening as the distance between us shrank. No matter how fast I ran, he was always there, just behind me, always watching, always waiting. When I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, the remnants of that terrifying encounter clung to me like a second skin. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, a figment of my imagination, but the feeling lingered, a gnawing anxiety that settled deep in my chest. The next night he was back. This time I was in a different place, a darkened room that felt eerily familiar. I looked around, disoriented, and then I saw him, the same man, but this time he was closer, his features sharpening into a horrifying clarity. He stood at the foot of my bed, a twisted grin stretching across his face, eyes glinting with malice. I wanted to bolt upright to scream, but I was paralyzed, rooted in place as he leaned closer, whispering words I couldn't understand. It was as if he was reaching into the very fabric of my dreams, tearing away my safety and leaving me exposed. With a surge of terror, I broke free from the nightmare and woke up gasping for air. This time I could feel my heart thumping against my ribs, a frantic reminder that I was alive. The following days blurred together as my dreams intensified. Each night he became more real, more vivid, and each time I woke up feeling like I had run a marathon, exhausted and trembling. I started to notice small changes in my waking life, scratches on my walls that I could swear hadn't been there before, shadows flickering in the corners of my vision, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Then came the night that changed everything. I had just woken from a particularly vivid dream, the man inches from my face, his breath hot against my skin. I stumbled out of bed, heart racing, desperate for fresh air. I opened the window and leaned out, trying to ground myself in reality. That's when I saw him standing across the street, illuminated by the flickering streetlight. My heart sank, the world around me blurring as I realized he was no longer confined to my nightmares. He was real. I slammed the window shut, panic clawing at my throat. How could this be happening? I rushed to the phone, dialing my best friend Sarah. "You need to come over." I'm being watched," I stammered, the fear bubbling over. "Calm down," she said, trying to soothe me. "I'll be right there." But before she arrived, I felt the weight of his presence outside my window, an invisible thread tethering me to that dark figure. I paced back and forth, my mind racing through possibilities, all the while feeling that he was just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. When Sarah arrived, I tried to explain. "He's been in my dreams, and now he's here. He knows me." She frowned, skepticism crossing her face. "You've been under a lot of stress. It's probably just a coincidence." But deep down, I knew this was no coincidence. The next few nights unfolded in a haunting rhythm, my dreams becoming darker, the man always a breath away from grabbing me. He never spoke, but his intentions were clear. He wanted me, and he was growing closer. Then came the night he finally spoke. I found myself in that alley again, and this time I didn't run. Instead, I faced him, adrenaline coursing through me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steady despite my fear. He stepped forward, and the darkness around him seemed to pulse. "You invited me," he whispered, his voice like gravel. "You called me into your world. With a jolt, I woke up again, the weight of his words echoing in my mind. What did he mean? I hadn't invited anyone, had I? My thoughts spiraled, and panic set in as I realized I was losing control, losing myself. That day I decided to investigate. I scoured through old photos, social media, anything that might provide a clue. But every search led to a dead end. My mind was fraying at the edges, tethered to a reality that felt increasingly unstable. Then, late one night, I was jolted awake by a noise. A soft scraping sound, like nails on wood, pulling me from the depths of sleep. My heart raced as I froze, listening. It was coming from my closet. I had to know what it was, so I grabbed my phone and shone the flashlight toward the door. There he was. The man stood in my closet. A grotesque smile stretched across his face. My body froze as I realized I was awake, but somehow, he was here. The violation of my space crashed over me like a wave, suffocating and absolute. He stepped closer, and I stumbled back, my breath quickening. "You shouldn't have looked for me," he hissed, and I felt my blood run cold. In that moment, the boundaries between my nightmares and reality shattered. I bolted for the door, heart pounding, but as I turned the handle, I found it locked tight. The terror gripped me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I was trapped with him. Panic surged as I scrambled to find another way out. And then I remembered my window. I rushed to it, throwing it open, but just as I was about to climb out, I felt his hand on my shoulder, icy and clammy. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the night. Then I woke up again. But this time I was in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering. It felt so real, so visceral, but was it just another nightmare? I glanced around, and my heart sank. The room was the same, but something was off. My closet door was slightly ajar, and I could have sworn I heard a whisper. "You can't run from me." I jumped out of bed, adrenaline flooding my veins. I rushed to the door, flinging it open. I needed to escape, needed to break free from this nightmare. But as I stepped into the hallway, I found myself face to face with him. There he was, his dark eyes glinting with a sinister light. "You thought you could hide," he taunted, stepping closer, invading my personal space. I backed away, heart pounding. But there was nowhere to go. "What do you want?" I gasped, my voice trembling. He smiled, and in that moment I knew I was trapped in a twisted game. I could feel the walls closing in, the darkness suffocating me. This was no longer just a nightmare, it was my reality. I stumbled backward, searching for an escape, but the world around me warped and twisted, merging the nightmare with the waking world. The weight of his gaze felt like a vise, squeezing out all hope. In that final moment, as he advanced, I understood what he meant when he said I invited him into my world. I had been too curious, too reckless, and now I was his captive, caught in a never-ending cycle of fear and despair. I don't know how long I've been trapped here, oscillating between dreams and reality, but I can tell you this: the man who haunts my sleep is no longer just a figment of my imagination. He's here, lurking in the shadows of my mind, waiting for the next moment of weakness to pounce. If you ever see him lurking at the edge of your dreams, don't invite him in. You may not be able to wake up. I had never believed in ghost stories, not until we moved into that house. It wasn't supposed to be haunted, cursed, or even old enough for secrets. Yet, every corner held something dark, something waiting to surface. We bought the house in a rush. It seemed like a dream, an old Victorian nestled in a quiet, forested neighborhood, isolated enough to feel like an escape. The agent called it a charming fixer-upper, but we loved it the moment we stepped in. It had the kind of creaky floors and steep staircases that felt almost timeless. We were going to turn it into a home, our sanctuary. Everything seemed fine at first. We spent the first few weeks tearing down wallpaper, fixing the plumbing, and slowly unpacking. But then, we noticed it. Behind a large, heavy wardrobe in the upstairs hallway, There was something peculiar. At first it looked like part of the wall, covered in the same faded wallpaper. But the closer we looked, the more it became clear there was a door behind it. A door that had been sealed shut. My partner, Lisa, stared at it for what felt like an hour. "Why would someone seal off a room?" she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out," I replied. We moved the wardrobe aside, and with a little effort, pried open the door. The staleness of the air that hit us was overwhelming, as if it hadn't been disturbed for decades. Inside, the room was dimly lit by narrow windows that let in just enough light to make out the details. At first glance, it looked untouched. A bed, a dresser, a few old trunks scattered around the room. Dust had settled on everything, except the bed. Its sheets were wrinkled, the kind of wrinkle you see after someone has been lying on it. Lisa and I exchanged a look, a creeping unease settling over us. "Someone's been here," she whispered. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just old, maybe the wind. I didn't even believe myself. That wrinkle was too fresh, too deliberate." But what came next was worse. The next morning we found something. It was small, barely noticeable at first, a key on the kitchen counter. Neither of us had ever seen it before. It looked ancient, rusted around the edges, with a small, worn tag attached to it. Written in faint ink were the words for when they come back. "What the hell is this?" Lisa asked, holding it up, her voice strained with tension. I don't know, I answered, but I felt the gnawing in my gut. Something wasn't right. Maybe it was a joke, something left behind by the previous owners. But then, why leave it here after all this time? And why now? That night I couldn't sleep. Lisa tossed and turned beside me, the silence of the house pressing down on us. But in the middle of the night I heard something faint, almost inaudible at first. A shuffling noise like feet dragging across the floor, coming from the hallway. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, straining to listen. Lisa stirred beside me, her breath quickening as she noticed the tension in the room. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, clutching the blanket tight. I nodded. It was real, too real to be ignored. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy flashlight, and tiptoed toward the hallway. The house groaned around me, but the sound was unmistakable now, louder. It was coming from that room. The sealed room. Every part of my body screamed to stop, to turn around and run, but I kept moving, inching closer to that door. When I finally reached it, I could hear the distinct sound of something being moved inside. The door was ajar. Slowly, I pushed it open, and was greeted by nothing but shadows and silence. The bed, once neatly made, now looked completely disturbed, as if someone had violently thrashed about on it. Items that had been undisturbed were now scattered across the floor. And then I saw an old journal on the nightstand, one I knew hadn't been there before. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The pages were yellowed, the ink smudged in places, but as I flipped through, one entry stood out. "They watch me when I sleep. I hear them breathing. I hear them moving." My blood turned to ice. I felt eyes on me, but when I turned around, there was no one. Just the oppressive feeling of being watched, hunted. I backed out of the room, my mind racing, and slammed the door behind me. The following days were a blur of paranoia. Every creak, every whisper of wind through the cracks of the house felt like a warning. Objects began to disappear and reappear in strange places. Photos we had taken started showing a figure in the background, always distant, always blurred, as if moving just out of sight. Lisa's nerves were fraying. She barely spoke anymore, her eyes constantly darting toward the sealed room. One night she broke down in tears. "We have to leave, Mark. There's something wrong here. We need to go." But it wasn't that simple. Every time we tried to leave, something happened. Keys went missing, the car wouldn't start, or the doors themselves seemed to jam. It was as if the house wouldn't let us go. And then it happened. I woke up one night to find Lisa standing at the foot of the bed, her back turned to me. I called out her name, but she didn't respond. When I approached, I saw something in her hand, a piece of paper. She turned to me slowly, her eyes wide with terror, and handed me the note. In shaky handwriting it read, "I've been here all along, watching, waiting." Before I could react, there was a sound of scraping, dragging noise coming from the hallway. It was close, too close. Lisa screamed, and I spun around, heart racing. But all I saw was the door to the sealed room, swinging open slowly. We fled. There was no more staying, no more rationalizing. Whatever was in that house wanted us gone, but not before driving us to the edge of madness. We never went back, but sometimes in the quiet of the night I think I can still hear it, that soft, shuffling noise, like feet dragging across the floor, waiting for someone else to find the room.